hasn't been a guest speaker. I'm not sure that is the reason why we wouldn't do it, but as far as notifying you, I had a conversation with a few board members about this situation, and I felt that I was very near my concern to reach the COMA violation if I spoke to too many people about it. Therefore, I could not reach out to everyone to give you a heads up. So I apologize that you were not notified about this in advance. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I would like to clarify that, Mr. Williams, that I asked to have Mr. Doug Shane put on the agenda.
Okay, so I want to go over a few ground rules before we move on to the next items that we have here. One, we do have a guest speaker, Dr. Doug Shane. I believe he is here at the table. He is going to speak to us today. He has been invited by board members to do so. The guidelines for him speaking are very similar to the guidelines for public forum. And those guidelines, which I'm sure he is aware of, he is a board member of the Lewisburg School District. He is aware of our guidelines, and I appreciate him following our mask mandate and being here today, even though that is not consistent with theirs necessarily. I'm not 100% sure of that. But what I want to be clear on is that we do expect every person that represents and presents to the board to be respectful of the board, be respectful of the citizens in our community, be respectful of our staff as well as our students. There is no addressing each one of them individually or specifically in your meetings. If you do so in your questions, then you will be asked to stop speaking and have a seat, and we'll move on to the next one. So we do expect to see that as for everyone tonight. I'm going to go ahead and read the rules of our public forum prior to having Dr. Shane speak. The purpose of a school board meeting is to conduct business on behalf of USD 234. This is an open meeting under the COMA, Kansas Open Meeting Act. Under COMA, patrons are entitled to listen but not entitled to speak unless invited by the board to do so in public comments. The board extends the right to speak to any member of the public during our public forum, so long as his or her comments meet the following conditions. 1, the presentation shall not exceed 3 minutes. Presentations may not contain personally identifiable information or public criticism of the student or employee. 3, presentations must be relevant to the scope and authority of the board. 4, the speaker must address the board from the podium. If the patron chooses not to comply with these guidelines, he or she will be asked to forfeit the remainder of the time and take their seat. Each person who's going to speak tonight has signed a waiver identifying that they understand those. And so I hope to have a really good meeting tonight. I hope to share a lot of information and again, continue to be transparent in our community. So at this time, I would like to ask Dr. Doug Shane if he would like to address the podium and speak to the board. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, very good. These are interesting times, aren't they? I never imagined that I would be coming down to Fort Scott to speak about COVID management in school districts. I never imagined this would be something that I would be doing, but here I am. I've got fond memories of this town, coming down here as a young man from Lewisburg to compete in FFA career development events down here in Fort Scott. And remember fondly coming down to the fort. And as indicated, I am from Lewisburg, Kansas, straight shot down 69. And I'm happy to be here to represent some parents that I certainly sympathize with their position that they're in as parents, but to also offer dialogue and different approaches. And while I am not here representing the USD 416 Board of Education in Lewisburg, I'm not representing the board, I'm representing myself. I think that it is useful for school board members across the state to collaborate and engage in conversation, share ideas, figure out what works, so that we can all work for the betterment of educational quality for the young people of Kansas and setting them up for success. So to get started, I want to give everybody just a brief background, my history. Say some things that I am, some things that I'm not. For full transparency, I really appreciate the intentional comments on transparency, and I thank you for that as a fellow the state of Kansas. It's phenomenal to hear. So I am born in Kansas City, Missouri, was raised until 8th grade in Southern Overland Park, and my family made the decision to move us out to rural Miami County just before high school. I attended Lewisburg High School, graduated in 2007, and from there went to Kansas State University, where I obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Animal Health and Industry. And then I also obtained a Doctorate of Veterinary Medicine in 2015, and a PhD in Production Medicine and Epidemiology in 2016, along with a graduate certificate in Applied Statistics. So that's a bit of my academic training. There has been criticism that I position myself as a doctor when I am not. Well, in reality, I hold 2 doctorates, so in fact I am a doctor, but I am not a human physician. Nor do I work in public health, although my epidemiologic training is identical to or similar to that of anybody else who would be trained in epidemiology, be that a master's or PhD program. Being an epidemiologist makes you expert in analysis of data, searching out causation, and of course understanding and deploying statistics, whether it be in randomized clinical trials or in observational epidemiologic studies. That's a little bit about my professional background. I currently work in the animal health industry in research and development. I have no financial gain by being here. My only interest is the children of Kansas, of which I have 3. That's a little bit about my background. I did start serving on the USD 416 Board of Education in January of this year. I filled a vacancy. Interesting times to jump in, never having served on the board. And so I bring a different perspective. I am exceedingly passionate about liberty and freedom. I do self-identify as a political conservative, just for full transparency. And I believe that we can approach all issues with love, with grace, and no matter the issue, it's not a competition of who loves the kids more or who cares about humanity more. Everybody does. We all have different interpretations of facts and information that come in front of us and different approaches to how we want to see things done. And so I am not here to engage in argument. I'm not here to engage in a fight. I am here to help provide additional pieces of information and dialogue that maybe challenges what school boards have been speaking about for the last 1.5 years, going on 2 years this December that we've been in the COVID pandemic. So that's my preamble. Before you, I handed some information. As school boards, we make policy. Policy's tough. It's really tough. And there's a lot of things that we have to consider. We've had singular focus on a single issue and a single matter of health for the last 2 years. And we have been left in a position to trust and to take action based off of limited data and information. In my experience, when you make attempts to get additional data and information beyond what is publicly available, that is met with a swift no. And this is something I spoke about in Lewisburg, that due to my professional interests and my training, in addition to wanting to be a good board member and make good policy decisions for our students in Lewisburg, I tried to work with our state public health agencies. I tried to ask, can I get a breakdown, district by district, of COVID cases in school buildings? I will help build the database that looks at and documents what the school mitigation policies were in those districts and when they implemented them. And I would really like to see if we can evaluate a difference in the effectiveness of those measures and whether or not we need to do the things that so many of us are still doing to this day. So before you, I've printed out some data from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. I can't get a breakdown for you school district by school district. I know that many school districts do have their own breakdowns. What I can tell you is that in a year and a half, if you look at school-related clusters in the state of Kansas, there have been 154 total COVID-19 clusters in a year and a half, with just shy of 1,900 positive cases attributed to those clusters, 21 hospitalizations, and 1 death for the entire state of Kansas in a year and a half. As we currently sit today, in our second week of school for many districts, we currently have 3 clusters with 31 cases, 0 hospitalizations, and 0 deaths. That's the current status of COVID-19 in schools in the state of Kansas, at least according to KDHE when these data were closed out. And it appears that the current reported cluster, one of the current reported clusters, is at a private academy with our good friends in Independence, Kansas. These are pretty low numbers. And this is one of the challenges that we face, especially as school districts, is balancing out real versus perceived risk and trying to balance out the deleterious effects of some of our policies on educational quality and the educational environment for our students. Also, as part of the KDHE data, I did print out the weekly report, sometimes updated twice weekly, to show you that in the last half week, Bourbon County had an additional 18 cases logged. Last week to this week, and prior to that, there was approximately 33 cases logged. Where you're at today. I don't know the current active case numbers, but I can tell you that those were the new cases. We also have seen an increase in diagnostic testing being performed and reported to the state. This is probably a mixture in the increasing prevalence of the Delta variant, and so there are more people coming down with symptomatic disease, but there's also the phenomena of there's been an increased amount of testing in children under 18 as we go back to school. Inevitably, you will find some positives when you start testing massive numbers of children, like our friends in Kansas City, Kansas, have recently found out as they implement testing as a criteria for entry into the school, and they continue to identify positive child after positive child without having symptomatic disease. This is another challenge that we face. We also have to take into consideration, this has been one of our great challenges in Lewisburg, is saying, what is the usefulness or what is the impact, what is the quality of what it is that we're doing? And I give specific challenge to our local public health office, recognizing that they do not necessarily come up with the criteria for what a close contact is on their own, recognizing that they too have to do their best to follow guidance that's given to them from higher authority. In Lewisburg, we just quarantined over 40 students in our K through second grade school because of one student that tested positive. I know that in Osawatomie, they just quarantined almost 60. This happened all last year as well. Now, fortunately, our local health office in Miami County is allowing students to be monitored very closely in school. So we're not disturbing school place attendance in some of the same ways that we were last year. But one of the important questions that I asked of our public health office, and I would challenge you all to do the same, is one, how many quarantines were issued? In Miami County, when I asked this question earlier this summer, the answer was 4. 4? In over a year, in the middle of a pandemic that we're all screaming that we're dying, we've quarantined 4 people in Miami County, Kansas. Well, the answer to that question is well, yeah, that's how many formal quarantine orders we gave. We've been issuing informal quarantine orders, which is not defined by Kansas statute. I'm assuming that a similar situation has happened here in Bourbon County. that if you ask your local health office how many quarantines have been issued, the answer will be an exceedingly low number. I encourage everybody to review Kansas Statute 65-129C. As school board members, we are expected to follow the law. I expect the same of any public institution. These attendance challenges are one of the reasons why we went to masks. We were told that masks would keep our kids in school. Not that masks would protect their health, because children have exceedingly low risk as it relates to COVID-19. But to keep them in school, I don't think that that's an honorable criteria. To put on a physical mechanism onto a child's face who has no choice and who cannot speak for themselves, and to induce trauma. One of the articles that I provided to you was published in the Journal of Psychiatry Research about the impacts of this pandemic, specifically on the mental health of children of ethnic minorities and low socioeconomic status. Mask wearing was not a specific component of this study, but I'll draw you to one of the conclusions of this piece of scientific literature. Together, these data suggest that children's fears of illness increased over time, and these effects were independent of race and socioeconomic status. An increase in fear over time has mental health implications, given that symptoms of fear-based disorders, for example, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, typically begin in the first 2 decades of life. Our children, we often say, are resilient. They are not. Some children internalize. Some children externalize. But we've put them into a constant state of stress, making them believe that their lives are in harm and in jeopardy, when in fact, every day, we do things that put ourselves in harm's way. And we have not tried to teach our children how to measure the realities of risks that they face, and instead we've traumatized them. This isn't just our doing. This is institutions across our country. This isn't me saying that COVID-19 isn't real. This isn't me saying that families haven't suffered tragedy and loss. You're darn straight, there's been a lot of families that have. But we're dealing with a disease that has a lower infection fatality rate than the flu. And we haven't done this before. And the question becomes, what's our marker for a change in behavior? What do we expect our public health agencies to tell us about how well what we're doing is working? I'm going to go back to the quarantines. One of the things that I've asked in Lewisburg is that these 40 students, I want to know how many actually become positive or symptomatic. If the answer is 0, as was the case with pretty much every quarantine last year that happened in our school district, we are needlessly impacting the lives of students and parents. And we are creating a dynamic that pits citizen against citizen and creates anger and resentment that doesn't need to be there. And it creates stress in our kids that doesn't need to be there. I challenge you guys, as we look at quarantines moving into this year and as we look at policies moving into this year, 1, we should say, is there a need? 2, it's how do we measure the effect? A couple other studies to help look at effect. And so I provided 2 studies that were epidemiologic observational studies looking at mask wearing in school districts. One published by the CDC, one published by Oscar et al. The CDC looked at participating school districts in the state of Georgia. I'll be quite blunt, their statistical approaches are abhorrent, and I'm really disappointed in the CDC. There's a phenomenon in scientific studies, there's two phenomena. One is pseudo-replication, one is confounding. And it's really prevalent in a potential risk of bias in any observational epidemiologic study. Confounding specifically is the inability to separate the impact of two variables. We see this a lot in anecdotal reporting of, man, we had like no cases, those masks work. Okay, well, the masks are one thing that you've done. We've also been really vigilant about sending sick kids home. We've also deployed less restrictive and personally invasive strategies like creating cohorts. We've increased air exchanges in buildings. We've put in new ventilation equipment. We have deployed numerous other mitigation measures, many times without credit because we all focus on the mask, that arguably have much more effect. Both of these studies did report a numeric reduction in COVID-19 cases when they looked at the specific factor of masks. We can get into the statistics. The CDC statistics were done wrong, to be blunt. But they talk about a 37% reduction in the incidence of COVID-19 when adults were required to wear masks, so mask mandates for staff only. Statistically significant. And a non-statistical reduction when there was an overall generalized mask mandate. And if you look at the relative risk calculation, they would say that the protective effect of wearing masks or having mask requirements for all students, the relative risk is 0.79. So you have about a 21% lower chance of a COVID case in one of those districts. This is what the CDC says. Well, how many cases were there actually during this reporting time period? The average during this time period in these school districts was 3 per 500 students. So a 20% decrease going from 3 to something a little over 2. We're not talking about big numbers here, folks. So we can throw around percentages, but sometimes you need to look at the absolutes to measure out what's the real risk. I often tell people that because a lot of the anti-mask is, well, masks don't work. I like to correct people and say, well, it depends on what you'd like to define as works. And it honestly does. But we also don't talk about the cost benefit. And does the benefits of mask wearing outweigh the costs? We know the deleterious effects of masks on the educational environment. I doubt that you could walk through any one of these school buildings and say that there was a teacher that liked playing mask police and are excited about doing it again. I think that if you ask students when they are being given detentions and discipline for poor mask compliance, that also has negative impacts on their psyche and their happiness in the school building. These studies would indicate mask wearing has minimal effect at best. Minimal effect at best. But have the conversation of, is there enough benefit to justify? And is Fort Scott deploying methods to say, is what we're doing working or necessary? In Lewisburg, one of the things that I challenged our board, as I said, let's come back, masks optional. We are still masks optional. But as you see our phases, and this is one of the documents that I provided to you, is our operational agenda, just to share stuff that other districts are doing. I said, prior to taking additional action, I would like to see evidence of community transmission in the schools. What does that mean? That means that I had a student that was symptomatic and test positive for COVID-19 that was in the school building, and individuals that were identified as a close contact with that person ended up becoming positive cases themselves. That would be evidence of community transmission. Let's start there. Let's see if that's happening. If that happens, then we can think about deploying other measures. We can think about getting more restrictive with our cohorts, smaller cohorts, tighter groupings, so on and so forth. Never would you see in that operational addendum a straight jump to a mask mandate. Part of the reason is that if you make a straight jump based off of numbers alone, There's no context behind a number. So say we put a case number. We had 1% active cases of our student body. That 1% doesn't tell you 1%, and that 1% all comes from one classroom. 1%, it all comes from one building, or it's 1% represented across every building in the district. The measures that you might deploy probably matter, are probably going to depend on the context. Right? It's an important question to ask. How many students am I going to have to impact with this mitigation? How is it going to impact? How and for how long? Right now we're in an indefinite cycle. And I would challenge you to break the indefinite cycle and give some really clear criteria on how you set what mitigation strategies will be in place. If you guys are like us, we have a lot of mitigation strategies that we are still maintaining. We still have thermal cameras when you come into our buildings that take the temperature of every person that comes into our school buildings. We are still vigilant about sending students home. All of our staff have been trained how to recognize signs of illness. We are still encouraging management of cohorts where possible, achievable, so on and so forth. We've increased ventilation and air exchanges in our buildings. It helps we're in the middle of a bond project and we're swapping some of those HVAC systems out as well. But these are the things that really have an impact. And actually, if you look at ventilation, ventilation is consistently one of the factors that has the biggest role in managing a respiratory virus indoors. I only have one other piece of scientific literature I provided to you. This was recently published 17th of May of this year in the Journal of Physics of Fluids. It was another mechanical mechanistic study performed on mannequins, looking at the filtering efficiency and air dynamics associated with facial coverings. They evaluated cloth masks, surgical masks, N95 and K95 masks, fitted masks. One of the things that you'll find from this piece of published literature, which would differ from what the CDC will say, is that even in experimental conditions with well-fitted mask materials on a mannequin, the filtering efficiency of one of these cloth masks was 8%, and of a surgical mask was 12% filtering efficiency. The fitted N95 and K95s were better at 40 and 60. I think it was 40 and 60%. But while they stop a direct respiratory droplet if someone coughs or sneezes, in theory, there is lots of escape around the edge of these masks. And really important factors for respiratory viruses like COVID is that these micro droplets essentially float in the air. So distance between people, the mask, all of this study would say, probably not the most important things to consider. You probably ought to look at ventilation. Because these things aren't doing the job that we're being told they're doing. And not to the magnitude. If we followed the CDC, we said that these were 95% of preventing transmission, we'd see even fewer cases of COVID than we do today. So look at some of the real world evidence. So I know I've brought a lot of information that I wanted to leave you with all of this. This has become such a polarizing issue. And I came down here at risk to myself. I have received numerous threats over the last week, including from staff members of our district. I get no money for this. It's time away from my 3 young kids. It's time away from my family farm, where I'd like to be also getting ready for hunting season. We're not doing that right now. But I want to have a dialogue and encourage all of you to have respectful dialogue and to try to implore every member of this community and the staff of this great city of Fort Scott, the great district here at Fort Scott, to engage in healthy conversation. Look for the outcomes that really matter for our kids. Don't have singular focus on a singular issue, which is where we're at today. And recognize that when this district did unfortunately go back to mandating masks without really having the evidence that it was necessary and that it would have positive impact, that there were a number of parents and students that were saddened by that. in Lewisburg, Kansas, we saw a phenomenon this last week of mothers crying, dropping their children off and picking them up because they didn't have the pleasure of seeing that joy of going to school for the last year and a half. And they got to have that joy this year. And that means a lot. And it meant a lot for our community. It meant a lot to those kids. And it means a lot to the parents. I really want to thank you guys for doing something that was rather uncomfortable. Mr. President, wow. You agreed to have a stranger come and speak in front of your board. And I really applaud it. And I applaud this community and you as a board and as a district for being willing to foster this dialogue and this conversation. It's really important. These kids are too important. The staff is too important to not have the conversation. So thank you.
Dr. Shane, one of the unique pieces about having a member or a person of our community speak on our agenda is what's different than the next step, which is the public forum, is that our board has an opportunity to engage you as well and ask questions. So I would ask that if anyone on the board has a question of Dr. Shane, and if he's willing to listen to those questions and answer as best he can, or have this dialogue, I would encourage you to have a dialogue if you have any questions.
Shane, I have a few questions. I've sent multiple emails to our county health office asking clarification questions on quarantine measures for that reason. As I'm speaking out of turn, let me know, but by our own statistics last year, I don't think we were able to determine a single case of community spread through our student body. Is that fair? And I think they have attributed that to the wearing of masks. And I think it's a common consideration. That surely if we didn't spread it between students, it's because they were wearing masks. And I think that is where we continue to struggle in how do we balance the need to protect staff, the need to follow the direction of the CDC and KDHE, and at the same time balance the needs of our students. Because at the end of the day, and I said this at the last meeting, I truly feel like we are missing what our greatest call is, and that is to make sure that we're delivering high quality education to our kids. And right now, it's being impeded by that. So can you tell me, in the conversations that you have with your public health office, how are you getting them to talk to you about what that is? Because I've sent emails and they don't want to answer.
I wish I could tell you it was a lot different in Miami County, and it's not. The local health office is largely not interested in engaging in dialogue, especially with those of us that are elected, or in my case, appointed to the Board of Education. And they don't want to engage in the dialogue and defend their actions in public forum either. As a matter of fact, they've been directed by the head of our public health office to you don't have to go to meetings if you don't want to, you don't have to engage in dialogue if you don't want to. That's not helpful. In the beginning of this pandemic, everybody was justifiably scared. And we gave a great deal of trust to our public health authorities. And I said this at our Lewisburg board meeting. They have failed to live up to that trust. And they fail to live up to it additionally when they will not come and engage with the Board of Education, and they will not evaluate the evidence hand in hand with the Board of Education. And trying to balance out what do we need to do for the COVID-19 pandemic, but also what about the other aspects of public health in our schools that we need to consider? And so I did put a lot of public pressure on our county health office. There was a lot of community pressure in Miami County. we had some progress. It's still not great. I still don't believe they're following the law as it relates to issuing quarantines. I still feel that they lack clarity in leadership. And I still feel that they are implementing guidance and policy without scientific merit. Follow the signs is something that we hear quite a bit. We're not doing such a good job of following the signs when we say that we did 100 things, but we're going to focus on the one thing that we fight the most about and say that that is the one thing that really worked. That's not following the science. We could also ask them, where's their long-term safety study for masks on children? They don't have it, right? So there's a lot of things at stake. I have huge distrust. We are not obligated, as a Board of Education, in my opinion, to 100% accept and take the guidance from our public health agencies. We're not. They provide guidance. They have also never run any school district, or Fort Scott, or Lewisburg, or Tonganoxie, or Garden City. They don't know what it's like. Our teachers do. Our admins do. Our superintendent does. As board members, you know what it's like to lead those meetings. There's a lot at stake. And when we have singular focus on a single issue, it makes it really, really challenging. And when we can't have transparent conversations and discuss, well, what's the need? Well, the need is because I say so. Right, but we had no transmission in our school buildings last year. Can we really assess what do we really need to do and what do we not need to do? Well, no, that's just evidence it all worked. Well, or is it because we were sending kids home and kids poorly vectored this virus anyway? That's what published literature would say. And when they won't engage in those conversations, it's not helpful. As a school district, we are responsible for the health and safety of our children and of our staff. We are not a public health office. We have not been given the lawful power of quarantine. We have been given the lawful authority to dictate terms of admission and who can come into our buildings and who can and under what circumstances. So certainly you guys as a board have the full authority to make those criteria, those dictates. But we only dictate what happens with the kids while they're in our care, not when they go home. And I understand that our public health offices were stretched for resources, and they have small operating budgets compared to other bureaucratic services and powers. But resourcing is not a criteria to not follow the law. If we were in the middle of a pandemic that was as deadly as they would have us all believe, why is it that formal quarantine orders were not given to all contacts of people with COVID-19 that carried the enforceable weight of law? Resourcing doesn't seem to be a great reason if imminent death is the likely outcome. And the reality is that imminent death is not the likely outcome. As a matter of fact, following an exposure becoming positive isn't even the likely outcome. The likely outcome is that you remain negative. So, it's a great challenge. And we are in a quandary as school districts of trying to balance what is our authority, what are our obligations, how do we have meaningful compromise? We have a lot of teachers that are scared too, and they're scared for their health and safety. How do we achieve meaningful compromise so that they can feel safe too? While also making sure that we're considering the needs of our kids and what is really needed to protect their health and safety. It's a great question. I wish I had a silver bullet for you, but I don't.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Shane?
I have a quick question. You've given us your return to school plan.
Mm-hmm.
Who was involved in planning of this, please?
So, me. But it was really championed by our superintendent and our admins. And there was consultation with the board. I took pretty strong positions on what I felt was appropriate for our district and reflected the values of our community. And so there was a lot of that known a priori and really things that were workable and amenable and meaningful compromise. And we certainly talked about the details as a board. Now, we presented that to our public health office, and it did not look like our other districts in the county. The other districts in the county more closely accepted verbatim the plans that the public health office promoted. We intentionally said, we're not comfortable with those plans. That's not what we're okay with doing in most. We can't change the criteria by which they quarantine students. That is not up to us, and we made that quite clear. That is not up to us. That is up to them. That's their job as a public health office. So we did have some conversations on clear distinctions of duty, authority, and responsibility. And we also clearly communicated that as long as we set those boundaries, we happily cooperate and work with them to ensure the health and safety of our community.
Any other questions for Dr. Shane?
I do. I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but I'm gonna try. You're on a board just like we are, and our board is divided. How is your board, and how were you able to have a transparent conversation among the board members and how do you singularly find it?
We are also a divided board. And we have two strong personalities. You can guess who one of them is. We are, right now in Lewisburg, we only have 6 board members. We have a vacancy, and we elected not to fill that vacancy because of our time proximity to the election. So we're operating at a 3-3 split right now. I will say that this addendum was passed by our board with a 5-to-1 vote. So not unanimous, but a 5-to-1. And we did achieve meaningful compromise. And we assured our community that we would evaluate data, new information, and we would be willing to call special board meetings whenever necessary as the situation on the field might change. And we asked for their trust in that. It does make it hard because in America, we can never underestimate our country's ability to politicize any issue. We've definitely done a pretty good job with COVID. But I do think that even in a divided board, you all can engage in peaceful, amicable conversation and debate. At the end of the day, your vote is your vote. And you vote for what you believe in and what you believe is best. These right here are a polarizing topic that will not go away. If you guys voted to end the mask mandate tonight, you would get emails from parents that said that you must hate children and you want them all to die. It's the reality of the world that we live in. But you have to make the vote that your heart tells you is the right vote to cast. The most important thing is that we recognize that at the end of the day, everyone is sovereign to themselves. These children belong to their parents and to God. And you all are the leaders of a public education institution which provides the most important service of any other government entity in the state of Kansas. It's not a light responsibility. But we have to get away from the unhealthy conversations, the character assassinations. I literally had people tell me that I hate kids with cancer because I brought up the fact that since this pandemic started, fewer than 400 children under the age of 18 have died. If you look, now there's not a breakdown of those deaths. CDC didn't do that. The reports that were in the news media brought forward by scientists at Johns Hopkins have since been struck from the internet. but they did look at an analysis of some of those cases. All had significant comorbidities. One of the important comorbidities to account for is childhood leukemia. We have to protect those kids, but we need to ask the question of how do we best protect those kids? And how do we communicate appropriate perception of risk to those kids that are healthy? And how do we encourage our kids to understand that being healthy is important? It's important to eat healthy. It's important to not be overweight. It's important to exercise, eat fruits and vegetables, maintain a healthy vitamin balance. So we have to get away from the vitriolic language. I've said this to people that have come after me in our community, is that I'm not engaged in I'm not going to engage in conversation or debate, where it's an argument and a debate of who cares for the kids the most. That helps nobody. We all care. Some of you will interpret the data information I provided tonight very differently from how I interpret it. That's okay. Know how your heart tells you, listen to your community, and carefully consider all sources of information and ask critical questions. And cast your vote. That's the biggest thing. We have to heal our communities in America. This is true for COVID. It's true for all kinds of polarizing topics that I am sure are already starting to creep into Fort Scott just like they are in Lewisburg. That you guys haven't even probably touched yet, neither have we, but we will. We have to have healthy conversation, and we have to love and respect each other. That's the biggest thing. Hope that answers your question.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Shane? Dr. Shane, I want to thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate your willingness to answer our questions as well. Thank you.
You bet. Feel free to use my district email if anybody would like to reach out. Again, I just want to clarify, I'm not here on behalf of the USD 416 Board of Education. I'm here on my own. Just to re-emphasize that. But thank you all for being willing to engage in the conversation.
Thank you.